Hello everyone. Welcome to my Workbook Solutions videos for Managerial Accounting. This video covers Chapter 19, Activity-Based Costing. Please note that if you are watching this video at a much later date than it was posted, the chapter number may have changed as well as the page number of each example in your workbook. Overall, that shouldn't matter as the example problems we'll work through will still help explain the material. I'll also show the question in its entirety within the presentation, so you won't actually need a copy of the workbook, though having one will make the process much easier for you. Without further ado, let us proceed. Turn to page 5 of this chapter's section in your workbook, where we'll start with dimensional analysis. You may have seen this method of solving certain math problems before in a chemistry or physics class. If not, I'll provide a quick primer here. This material is actually very important, not just for this chapter, but for life in general. If you understand dimensional analysis, you can find applications for it all throughout the remainder of your life. Starting with letter A. If a football field is 100 yards long and a single yard equals 3 feet, how many feet long is a football field? In this problem, we're seeking to convert 100 yards into feet. Our conversion rate is 1 yard per every 3 feet. When you perform such a conversion, the unit we're converting to needs to be above the line. The unit we're converting away from needs to be beneath the line. Effectively, the units on top cancel against the units on bottom, and the unit that isn't canceled is the unit of our answer. If you don't follow how the math is performed, multiply the numbers above the line and divide by those below it. So in this case, you would multiply 100 by 3 over 1. I know this particular example is very basic, but as you encounter more and more complex problems, using the process shown here will be invaluable. Item B. A road trip from Atlanta to New York City takes approximately 15 hours. How long would that trip be in seconds? Here we're converting 15 hours into seconds. First, we convert hours to minutes by multiplying 15 by 60 over 1. Then we convert from minutes to seconds by multiplying by 60 over 1 yet again. The units above the line cancel with those below the line. The remaining unit is that of our answer, so that drive takes 54,000 seconds. Item C. A particular Caterpillar backhoe excavator can displace 800 pounds of earth every minute. How many kilograms can it displace in an hour? Your workbook doesn't specify the following, but there are approximately 2.2 pounds in a kilogram. We start with our 800 pounds of earth displaced per minute, which we want to convert to kilograms per hour. It doesn't matter in which order we apply our conversion rates. We'll arrive at the same answer regardless. If we convert to kilograms first, we'd multiply that 800 over 1 by 1 over 2.2. Our pounds will cancel out, and this product would be in kilograms per minute. We can then convert minutes into hours by multiplying by 60 over 1. In this case, the minutes above the line cancel against the corresponding minutes below it. Multiply these numbers out, and this caterpillar can displace approximately 28,818.2 kilograms every hour. Last one. Item D. A Kawasaki Ninja 500 averages 60 miles per gallon. If 1 gallon of gasoline costs $3.45, How much does it cost to ride this motorcycle 100 miles? If you didn't already do so with the last one, pause the video and see if you can calculate this cost. Start with our 100 miles ridden. We can multiply that distance by 1 gallon over 60 miles to get how much fuel is burned. See how the miles above and below the line would cancel, and this product would be in gallons. Next, multiply by our cost of gasoline, and the fuel cost for this trip would be $5.75. Turn to page 6 to consider Redwood Marine Company. The total factory overhead for Redwood Marine Company is budgeted for the year at $1,548,000. Redwood Marine manufactures two types of boats, speedboats and bass fishing boats. The speedboat and bass boat each require 4 direct labor hours for manufacture. Each product is budgeted for 9,000 units for the year. Determine the total number of budgeted labor hours for the year. Then determine the single plant-wide factory overhead rate based upon direct labor hours. Finally, determine the factory overhead allocated per unit for each product using the single plant-wide factory overhead rate. Do so for speedboats per unit and bass boats per unit. Starting with letter A, how do we determine the total number of budgeted labor hours for the year? We know we anticipate producing 9,000 units of each product. This means we anticipate manufacturing 9,000 speedboats and 9,000 bass boats. How many labor hours will be required for these 18,000 boats? Each individual boat requires 4 direct labor hours. So we'll multiply those 9,000 speedboats by 4 over 1. Total direct labor hours required for speedboat production is therefore 36,000 hours. Bass boats also require 4 direct labor hours per boat. So apply that same conversion rate to the 9,000 bass boats, and those units will also require a total of 36,000 direct labor hours. In total, this plant needs 72,000 direct labor hours to cover all of production. Now for letter B. How can we calculate our single factory overhead rate? We know our total direct labor hours as well as our total annual factory overhead, so we can simply divide the latter by the former. Determine the factory overhead allocated per unit for each product using the single plant-wide factory overhead rate. Before we go any further, let's summarize our information. From letter A, we calculated that both speedboat and bass boat production will require 36,000 direct labor hours each. In letter B, we calculated an overhead allocation rate of $21.50 per direct labor hour. Our first step in determining overhead allocated per speedboat is to figure total overhead allocated to speedboat. We take our total direct labor hours for speedboats and multiply it by $21.50 over 1. Total overhead allocated to speedboats is $774,000. Now to get overhead allocated per speedboat, we take that $774,000 and divide it by 9,000 units. Overhead per speedboat works out to $86 per boat. We then repeat the process for bass boats. Conveniently, the bass boat figures are identical to those of the speedboats, so both the process and the math computations will be the same. Overhead allocated per bass boat, $86. Turn to page 7. Noteworthy Instruments makes 3 kinds of musical instruments: trumpets, trombones, and French horns. The budgeted factory overhead cost is $104,960. Overhead is allocated to 3 products on the basis of direct labor hours. The products have the following budgeted production volume and direct labor hours per unit. Determine the single plant-wide overhead rate. In Part B, we'll use the overhead rate from Part A to determine the amount of total and per unit overhead allocated to each of the 3 products. Starting with Part A, we know our total factory overhead. If we divide that amount by the total labor hours required for all 3 product lines, we'll have our plant-wide overhead rate. So let's figure out our total direct labor hours starting with the 1,800 trumpets. To get hours required for their manufacture, we'll multiply that amount by the 0.5 direct labor hours per trumpet. Multiply that out, and these 1,800 trumpets require 900 direct labor hours. We'll perform the same computation for the 500 trombones, but multiply them by 1.4 labor hours per unit instead. Total hours required, 700. Repeat the calculation one more time, but for French horns. Total direct labor hours required, 1,680. Sum these 3 amounts, and total labor hours required for all 3 product lines is 3,280. Now that we have our total direct labor hours, divide that number into the total factory overhead. The single plant-wide overhead rate will be $32 per direct labor hour. With our overhead rate established, we can now fill out the table in Part B to determine the amount of total and per unit overhead allocated to the 3 product lines. Our overhead rate is allocated based upon direct labor hours. In Part A, we calculated the direct labor hours required for each category of instruments. Now we can use our dimensional analysis to complete the table, starting with trumpets, which required 900 hours. Multiply that amount by the $32 of overhead allocated for every 1 direct labor hour, and overhead allocated works out to $28,800. To get our per unit overhead, we need our units manufactured, which was handily given in that first table for Part A. Divide our overhead allocated to trumpets by the number of trumpets produced, and the result is $16 per unit. We'll repeat these very same calculations for trombones. 700 direct labor hours multiplied by the overhead allocation rate yields $22,400 of overhead allocated. Divide that amount by the 500 trombones produced, and the overhead allocated per unit is $44.80. One more time for French horns. Multiply 1,680 direct labor hours by $32 of overhead allocated per hour, and total allocated overhead comes out to $53,760. Divide that amount by the 1,400 horns produced, and allocated overhead per unit is $38.40. Total cost of all allocated overhead sums to $104,960, which you hopefully recognize is the total overhead given to us in the problem. So our math checks out, meaning we can have confidence in our numbers. Turn to page 8 to reconsider Redwood Marine Company, but this time it uses multiple factory overhead rates. The total factory overhead for Redwood Marine Company is budgeted for the year at $900,000, divided across two departments, fabrication at $624,000 and assembly at $276,000. Redwood Marine manufactures two types of boats, speed boats and bass fishing boats. The speedboat requires 7 direct labor hours in fabrication and 3 direct labor hours in assembly. The bass boats require 5 direct labor hours in fabrication and 5 direct labor hours in assembly. Each product is budgeted for 400 units of production for the year. In Part A, determine the total number of budgeted labor hours for the year in each department. In Part B, determine the departmental factory overhead rates for both departments. And in Part C, determine the factory overhead allocated per unit for each product using the department factory overhead allocation rates. We'll start by determining the labor hours for each department. We know the company is making 400 speedboats and 400 bass boats. How many hours in fabrication are required for 400 speedboats? Each speedboat requires 7 hours in fabrication, so multiply those 400 boats by 7 over 1, giving us 2,800 hours in fabrication. Bass boats require 5 hours in fabrication per boat, so those 400 boats will require 2,000 hours in fabrication. Total fabrication hours comes to 4,800 hours. Now we repeat the process for the assembly department. Each speedboat requires 3 hours of assembly, so our conversion rate is 3 over 1, giving us a product of 1,200 assembly hours. Bass boats require 5 hours of assembly, so that product line's conversion rate is 5 over 1, giving us 2,000 hours in assembly for bass fishing boats. Total assembly hours is therefore 3,200 hours. Next, proceed to Part B and calculate the factory overhead rates for each department based upon labor hours. The budgeted labor hours in Part A are our starting point for Part B. We have our total fabrication hours, and we also have our total fabrication budget. Divide the latter by the former, and we have our overhead allocation rate for fabrication. We'll repeat the same process for assembly. Our assembly allocation rate is $86.25 per hour. With our rates known, we can now move on to Part C and determine the factory overhead allocated per each unit. Since we know our overhead allocated per hour, to get the dollar overhead allocated, we need the hours spent in our manufacturing departments. We already calculated those amounts in Part A. Starting with speedboats, these items required a total of 2,800 hours in fabrication. Multiply hours in fabrication by that department's allocation rate, and total fabrication allocated to speedboats is $364,000. From Part A, speedboats also required 1,200 hours in assembly. Multiply those hours in assembly by that department's allocation rate, and assembly overhead allocated to speedboats comes to $103,500. Combine that sum with the total fabrication overhead, and total overhead allocated to speedboats is $467,500. Remember that speedboat production is budgeted at 400 boats for the year, so our overhead per speedboat is $1,168.75. Now simply repeat these calculations for bass fishing boats. For bass boats, we repeat the same process of determining total fabrication and assembly overhead allocated to this product line. The allocation rate for fabrication and assembly will both remain unchanged. We just need our labor hours for bass boats in these two departments. We already calculated those amounts in Part A. Bass boats required 2,000 fabrication labor hours. Total fabrication overhead for bass boats, $260,000. In assembly, bass boats had another 2,000 hours. Total assembly overhead for bass boats, $172,500. The total overhead allocated to bass boats is therefore $432,500. Budgeted production for bass boats was also 400 units, so overhead per bass boat is $1,081.25. If you want to check your math, take your total overhead allocated to bass boats, as well as your total overhead allocated to speedboats. Note how they sum to $900,000 for total factory overhead. Overhead budgeted for fabrication and assembly was $624,000 and $276,000 respectively. Sum these two amounts, and total overhead is also $900,000. So our total overhead across our two product lines ties to the total overhead across our two manufacturing departments. So all overhead is accounted for. Consider the next problem on page 9. The management of Supernova Industries develops and manufactures gasoline and diesel engines through two production departments, fabrication and assembly. Presently, the company uses a single plant-wide factory overhead rate for allocating factory overhead to the two products. However, management is considering the multiple production department overhead rate method. The following factory overhead was budgeted for the year. Fabrication department factory overhead, $629,000. Assembly department factory overhead, $259,000. Direct labor hours were estimated as follows. In the fabrication department, 3,700 hours, and in the assembly department, another 3,700 hours. Additionally, the direct labor hours used to produce a unit of each product in each department were determined as follows. In the fabrication department, a gasoline engine requires 1.3 direct labor hours, and a diesel engine requires 2.7 direct labor hours. In the assembly department, a single gasoline engine requires 2.7 direct labor hours, while a diesel engine requires 1.3 direct labor hours. In Part A, determine the per unit factory overhead allocation to the gasoline and diesel engines under the single plant-wide factory overhead rate method using direct labor hours as the activity base. In Part B, determine the per unit factory overhead allocated to the gasoline and diesel engine under the multiple production department factory overhead rate method using direct labor hours as the activity base for each department. We'll begin with letter A and determine overhead allocated per each engine unit using the single plant-wide factory overhead rate. Determining the single plant-wide rate is a simple process. We know our total plant-wide overhead as well as our total direct labor hours. Divide the former by the latter and we get a single plant-wide overhead rate of $120 per direct labor hour. To get the overhead allocated to each individual engine, we merely require the labor hours per gasoline and labor hours per diesel engine. We have our per unit hours in the table at the bottom of the screen. Remember that with the single plant-wide rate, we don't distinguish between production departments. We only need the per unit labor hours for an engine in total. For a gasoline engine, that amount is 4 direct labor hours, and for a diesel engine, it is conveniently the same amount. So each gasoline and diesel engine requires 4 direct labor hours to produce. We'll then multiply those hours by the overhead applied on a per hour basis, and we get $480 of overhead per gasoline engine. We'll also get the same amount of overhead per diesel engine because the per unit labor hours and the allocation rate are the same. Now we proceed to Part B and calculate the per unit overhead for each gasoline and diesel engine using the multiple production department method. Using the multiple production department method requires us to calculate an overhead rate per department. We have our per department overhead amounts and their respective labor hours seen here. Divvy those amounts, and the fabrication department has an allocation rate of $170 per hour, and the assembly department has a rate of $70 per hour. With our department overhead allocation rates established, we simply need the time spent in these departments for each gasoline and diesel engine. Starting with the gasoline engines, an individual unit requires 1.3 hours in fabrication and 2.7 hours in assembly. Multiply the hours spent in fabrication by that department's allocation rate, and fabrication overhead allocated to a single gas engine is $221. The assembly overhead rate is $70 per labor hour, so multiply that rate by the 2.7 hours each gas engine spends in assembly, and assembly overhead allocated to an individual unit is $189. The total overhead allocated to a single gasoline engine is therefore $410. Now we repeat the process for diesel engines. A diesel engine spends 2.7 direct labor hours in fabrication. Multiply that time spent by $170 per direct labor hour, and fabrication overhead allocated is $459 per diesel engine. The same engine requires 1.3 direct labor hours in assembly. So multiply that amount by the $70 assembly overhead rate, and assembly overhead allocated to a diesel engine is $91. Total fabrication and assembly overhead allocated to a single diesel engine comes to $550. Finally, turn to page 12 to consider Iris Incorporated. Iris Incorporated manufactures lighting fixtures for entryways and dining rooms. 5 activities are used in manufacturing the fixtures. These activities and their associated budget activity costs and activity bases are as follows. We have 5 activities: casting, assembly, inspecting, setup, and materials. In the second column, we have the annual budgeted activity costs for those 5 activities. In the final column, we have the activity base used to measure the activity itself. So for casting, it is measured by machine hours. Assembly is measured by direct labor hours. Inspecting is measured by number of inspections. Setup is measured by number of setups. And materials is measured by number of loads. Corporate records were obtained to estimate the amount of activity to be used by the 2 products. The estimated activity-based usage quantities and units produced are shown below. For each activity base, you have their total hours, inspections, setups, or loads budgeted for the year in the far right column. The 2 middle columns break up the activity bases in the total column among entryway and dining room fixtures. Determine the activity rate for each activity: casting, assembly, inspecting, setup, and materials handling. Use the activity rates in Part A to determine the total and per unit activity costs associated with each product. Round to the nearest cent if necessary. Starting with Part A, we can figure out our various activity rates by looking back at our 2 tables. For the activity of casting, the first row in the top table provides the dollar amount budgeted for the year. The activity base is machine hours, which has a total budget of 9,940 hours for the year. To get our activity allocation rate per hour, we can divide the $328,020 by 9,940 hours. The activity rate works out to $33 per machine hour. With our activity rate for casting calculated, we simply need to repeat the previous process for assembly, inspecting, setup, and materials handling. Again, we have our budgeted dollar amounts for each activity in the top table, and their respective budgeted total activity bases in the bottom table. For each activity, divide its annual budget by its annual total base. Assembly will have a rate of $18 per direct labor hour. Inspecting will have a rate of $15 per inspection. Setup will have a rate of $143 per setup, and materials handling will have a rate of $46 per load. With our activity rates in place, we can now move on to Part B and determine the total activity cost for the entry and dining room fixtures as well as their respective costs per unit. Let's start with casting, then move down that list. $33 per machine hour is the casting activity allocation rate. The hours allocated to entryway fixtures is 5,270 hours. Multiply those numbers together, and the casting cost allocated to entryway fixtures is $173,910. Casting machine hours for dining room fixtures is 4,670 hours. Multiply these hours by the same casting allocation rate. And casting cost for dining room fixtures is $154,110. To get our total cost for our two types of fixtures, we need to track the total cost per activity, which we'll do so in the table shown here. The total casting cost for both fixtures sums to $328,020. Next, we'll repeat this process but for assembly. Assembly has a cost allocation rate of $18 per direct labor hour. Multiply this specific rate by the hours allocated to entryway and dining room fixtures, and the total assembly cost is $81,540 for entryway and $122,400 for dining room fixtures. Log these two amounts in our table for tracking total activity costs. The total assembly cost for our two types of fixtures is $203,940. Next, move on to inspecting. We have 1,440 and 450 inspections for entryway and dining room fixtures, respectively. Retrieve this activity's cost allocation rate, $15 per inspection. Inspecting cost allocated is $21,600 for entryway fixtures and $6,750 for dining room fixtures. Total inspection costs comes to $28,350. We're almost through. Next comes setups. We have 310 setups for entryway fixtures and 70 setups for dining room fixtures. The setup allocation rate is $143 per setup. The total setup cost for entryway fixtures is $44,330. Total setup cost for dining room fixtures is $10,010. Total setup cost, $54,340. Finally, we look at materials handling. Entryway fixtures have 770 loads of materials, while dining room fixtures have 200 loads. The materials handling cost allocation rate is $46 per load. Multiply the loads by the rate, and entryway fixtures has $35,420 of materials handling costs, while dining room fixtures has $9,200 of materials handling costs. The total materials handling costs allocated to our products is $44,620. Note that these total amounts for activity costs will reconcile to the total cost given in our problem information. Look back at that very first table and the budgeted activity costs. They reconcile with our calculated totals to the exact amount. Our total cost allocated to entryway fixtures is $356,800. For dining room fixtures, total allocated cost is $302,470. Finally, we'll figure out our cost per unit for our two product lines. Look back at the second table for the activity bases in your problem information. The last row gives the total units produced for our two types of fixtures. Cost per unit will be our total product cost divided by total units. For entryway lighting fixtures, divide the $356,800 of total allocated cost by 10,400 total units. The total cost per unit is $34.31. For dining room lighting fixtures, divide the $302,470 total cost by the 5,200 total fixtures to get a cost per unit of $58.17. That concludes this video. There may be a couple of problems in the workbook I didn't cover. If so, you can find their solutions in the course module on Blackboard. I encourage you to try them on your own to test your retention of the material. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you for watching.